I have a few kind of organizational announcements to make before we get started. The first being that it's been out for a while, but I should probably let you guys know that the final exam date and location and time are out. Okay, so that's also listed on the course information website. You can find that information there. April 18th in the morning. Okay? Other thing is that if you want to give feedback for the course, that should now be open. So you can go to feedback.uwo.ca, I would say. I would really appreciate if you guys do this for me because I'm early in my career and these kind of things make all the difference actually. Student evaluations are very valued in teaching applications. And my goal is to kind of teach at a teaching university. So if you could fill those out, it would be really helpful for me. So I appreciate that. So if you find some time to do that, those should now be open. The other thing is that I have the goal of grading all of your assignments by the end of the week. Okay, so that's assignment 1, the first paper. So some of you will already have your grade. You'll see. I think I got to February 25th, so if you submitted your paper by February 25th, you should have a grade. And instructions on how to get detailed feedback if you would like that, okay? Anything else? I suppose for assignment 2, I've extended the deadline so that it's not due on Easter Monday, it's due the next day. We still have class on Easter Monday, but I've made the assignment due the following day. Of course, if you need an extension, always please just contact me. I like people who have extensions, okay? All right. Any questions about any of that before we move forward? You guys are good? Okay, next thing is that I am a tornado, and I can't stay for the full time today. So what we're going to do is we're going to have an in-person lecture for the first half, so that's everything for chapter 10. That's everything for social cognition. For the second half of the lecture, instead of lecturing here, I will have videos posted by the end of the day that you can watch about pro-social behavior. Okay, so that corresponds to chapter 11. That's currently outlined on the OWL page if you want to read about that. Okay, so I'll have those videos for the second half of the lecture up by the end of the day. But for social cognition, we'll stick around, but then we'll probably take about half the time. Okay, any questions about that? Okay, great. All right, haven't seen you guys in a while like this, so I'm happy to be back. All right. I also forgot my water, so I'm kind of crazy today, so sorry about that. Look at my clothes even. All right. Deep breath. Okay, social cognition, lecture 8. Wow, we're already here. We're getting near the end. That's pretty exciting. Okay. All right, so important components of social cognition. Let's start out with that. We'll get to that video in a sec. But there are a few components of social cognition that your textbook outlines as kind of important components. Before we can get to the more complicated aspects of social cognition, what are some of the more basic aspects of social cognition? So one of them is detection of animacy. Okay. So you can think of that like detecting if something is an animate or an inanimate object, right? So something that's alive or something that is not. So that's obviously really useful. That's a really useful skill, right? Because you need to know what's animate, what's inanimate, in order to recognize conspecifics, so members of your own species, to identify predators, and to identify prey. Pretty straightforward, makes sense. If you're going to be able to have social cognition, you need to be able to detect what is an animal and what's not. And a nice example of this is with point light displays. So even in people, we see biological motion. We're kind of predisposed to see motion as either biological or not, right? So detection of biological motion is fundamental. So you might have seen something similar to this before. But see these points of light? You can kind of tell that it's a person walking. Here's just the torso of a person walking. They'll split it up into their components. The legs, they still look like legs, right? Even though they're just little dots of light. This is just the face. This one's a bit harder, of course. But even when we're just given points of light moving in a certain kind of way, we still detect a person is walking towards us, right? Even though there's no person there, they're just points of light moving. So these kind of experiments are trying to say, look, detection of biological motion is pretty fundamental, right? Another pretty important part of social cognition is the identification of faces. Right? Human beings, of course, are very good at detecting faces. And it can happen in other animals as well. Another important part of identifying faces is actually recognizing the emotions on those faces. Right? And that's an important part of social cognition. You need to be able to tell what someone is feeling, right? Or it's useful information at least. Maybe you don't need to. And you can often detect that from faces. And this can happen in other species as well. It's not just human beings who have facial expressions to show certain emotions, right? Chimps have different facial expressions as well. So it's important if you're going to have social cognition to be able to identify faces. Okay. An interesting experiment, though, outside of conspecifics, is if other species can recognize the faces of other species. So there's a few experiments that have looked to see if birds can recognize human faces. Okay, so this is the example in your textbook. They talk about mockingbirds. So basically, over 4 days, some experimenters behaved as intruders towards mockingbird nests. Okay, so mockingbirds don't want anyone to get near their nests, right? So over 4 days, these experimenters, to act as an intruder, would approach the nest and then put their hand on the nest. And the mockingbirds, they don't like that a whole lot, right? And what ended up happening, as you might expect, is that mockingbirds flushed the intruders faster and faster each day. Okay, so they started to identify the individuals as intruders, right? And so they became faster and faster at flushing them. Flushing just means trying to get them out, right? Start diving at them, start calling at them, try to get the intruder away from the nest. However, when a new experimenter approached, so someone with a different face, different walk, different gait, a different individual, right? The mockingbird flushed them at the same rate as the day for the original experiment. Okay. So the conclusion that was made from this study is that the mockingbirds were able to identify the identity of the individual experiment. Right. So this has been taken as some evidence that maybe birds can recognize human faces. Of course, there could be other features that the birds are picking up on. It might not just be the face, right? It could be a whole bunch of things. It can be the size of the body. It could be how the person walks. There's a lot of different factors here other than just face, right? But it's good to remember, though, that faces are good predictors of the presence of a social entity. And a social entity would just mean, another animal. Right? Faces don't really change. Other things can change. Features of your face usually stay the same. Right? So they're good predictors of an individual. Okay. So here's an interesting video that's a little bit creepy, but this is about crows now. So instead of mockingbirds, now we're looking at crows. So a similar kind of experiment, and he'll walk us through that.
Really, to me, the most surprising thing about crows so far has been their ability to recognize and remember particular people, and even just particular faces. This is Freeway Park, and it's an area where we've had crows banded for about 8 years now, and we caught them just recently, this past year again, with wearing a particular mask. So what we expect is, we were wearing masks now, and we should have birds scolding us even by this point. And when we put our masks on, I think you'll see a dramatically different response to the birds than certainly we're seeing right now. When we've done these experiments where we've had all different sorts of people wear the same face and see these crows respond so strongly and pass on this knowledge to others in their society, that's what really surprising me. I always knew they were smart. I always knew they could work in trial and error because they're tough to catch a second time. But to see them really be paying such close attention to us has been really eye-opening for me. We walk outside now with
Okay, so that there is an example where they're actually using a mask. So they're saying, okay, that particular face makes the crows upset, right? And they give that mask to different people, different individuals who would presumably have different body types, different heights, different gaits, but then they have the same face, right? Kind of interesting. Okay. But of course, identification of faces may not be as remarkable as it seems on the surface, right? We've talked a lot in this class about associative learning, right? Associating one stimulus with another. Associating a particular stimulus with a particular outcome, a particular response. Yeah. So you can see how, in these kinds of experiments, it would make sense that facial recognition, for other species especially, so not a member of your own species, could just be learned through associative learning, right? Okay, but what about aspects of social cognition that are not so easily attributable just to simple kind of associative learning? Things like theory of mind, mental attribution, and understanding intentions. Okay. So we're going to go through each one of these. But each of these concepts, you can't really easily just attribute to associative learning. All right, so let's go through each one. Starting with theory of mind. Can anyone tell me what theory of mind is? Yeah, go ahead. Right, right. So being able to understand that other people also have a mind. Talk about this a lot in developmental psychology, right? It takes time for children to develop theory of mind. But people also wonder, do animals have theory of mind? Do non-human animals have a theory of mind? Right. So here's a nice little written definition of that, understanding that others, and again here we're just going to talk about conspecifics, members of your own species, have minds and perspectives that differ from one's own. For example, understanding that I know what the next slide is in the lecture even though you do not, because I have a different mind and different information than you do. Right? Okay, but do other animals have theory of mind? Well, there's no clear answer. What a surprise. Seems like a lot of things we talk about in animal cognition, no clear answer. It's hard to study. But there are likely many ways animals can interpret the behavior of others. Maybe they don't need theory of mind. Right. You would think that theory of mind is pretty useful for interpreting the behavior of others, right? If someone behaves in a certain way that doesn't align with how you would behave in a certain situation, it might be easy to figure out if you have theory of mind. If you don't, it might be a bit more difficult, but there are many ways animals can interpret the behavior of others. They don't need necessarily theory of mind. It's not a prerequisite to understanding or being able to interpret other behaviors. It is certainly helpful, though. Okay. Okay, so kind of leading from theory of mind, we're going to talk about something called mental attribution. Okay. So this is pretty related to theory of mind, mental attribution. So when we're talking about mental states, these are feelings, desires, and intentions, right, that are attributed to an actor in a situation and assumed to be causal. Okay. So really, in other words, mental states are assumed causes of behavior. Okay. What does that mean? Okay, a mental attribution that I might have is that you are taking notes because you are interested in the material. And from those mental attributions, you can make predictions about future behavior. Okay. So you're going to study your notes from this class because you want to do well in the final. We're going to go through a few more examples of this. But really, mental attribution, understanding someone else's mental states, is helpful in understanding the action of others and interacting effectively with them. Right? Okay. I don't know why that's underlined. Don't worry about that. All right. Okay, here's a scenario, an example. There's a man reaching out for a book on an out-of-reach shelf on a bookcase. He can't reach the book, so he stops trying and starts looking on lower shelves. The ladder is then given to the man. What will the man do? Well, he might ignore the ladder and continue to look on the lower shelves, or he'll use the ladder to access the book he originally wanted. So based on his behavior, we're making attributions to his mental state. Right? He wants the book at the top. Or he doesn't want that book anymore. He's satisfied in another way. But you're making predictions about what could happen. Why is everything underlined? Okay. There are challenges, though, with determining someone's mental state. How do you determine another individual's mental state? Well, it's usually through looking at what they do, their behaviors, right? So again, this is kind of the way we're talking about this right now. It is a bit more philosophical, right? We're not talking about experiments yet. We're kind of doing thought experiments. A lot of comparative cognition starts out with a kind of philosophical basis. A lot of disciplines do, right? But sometimes it does feel like comparative cognition, animal cognition does that a bit more. Which I like. That's a cool thing. Okay, so a question, though. You do tasks of mental state attribution. Does success on those tasks require attribution of mental states, or are they solvable just simply using behavioral cues? So this is a distinction that your textbook makes, and the field can sometimes make as well. Okay. What does this even mean? Okay. Let's imagine a scenario. Hopefully this will clear it up a bit. Okay. So let's imagine two friends, Lisa and Max, at a party. Okay. Lisa notices Max standing alone in the corner, avoiding eye contact, fidgeting with his phone. Seems kind of uncomfortable. A mental state attribution would be attributing the mental state of discomfort or social anxiety based on his behavior. She may infer that he feels out of place or anxious in the social setting. Okay, so this is a mental state attribution. She's thinking, oh, he's anxious. He is uncomfortable. That's why he's in the corner. Or maybe she's just using behavioral cues. Doesn't necessarily need an attribution of a mental state. She just observes that Max is avoiding social interaction. Without explicitly considering his internal state. She might infer he's feeling uncomfortable. So there's a bit of nuance there, right? But they are different. Really the big difference is attributing a mental state. You still kind of have to read on behavior to be able to attribute a mental state. But you don't necessarily need to attribute a mental state in order to get the correct information. Again, this distinction might seem kind of pedantic, but it's important when we're thinking about animal cognition. Because people might say, oh, animals can attribute mental states to their conspecifics based on a performance on some kind of task. That's trying to see if animals can attribute mental states. But then a rebuttal to mental state attribution would be, well, maybe they're just relying on behavioral cues. It has nothing really to do with attributing a mental state. It does seem a little pedantic, but it's important when we're talking about animal cognition. Because there's a big difference between saying, oh, the chimp knows the other chimp is sad, and the chimp is observing behavioral cues. Does that make sense? Any questions about this? Okay. All right. So part of mental state attribution, part of reading behavior, has to do with understanding intentions of others. Understanding others' intentions. So that's understanding that behaviors are goal-directed. Right? We engage in behaviors to achieve some kind of goal, usually. Right? And also understanding what that goal is. Right? This is about understanding intentions. And these are mental states like wanting something, desiring something. So another distinction between mental attribution and just reading behavioral cues is if you think of why did the chicken cross the road, the classic example is to get to the other side. That would be just the behavior, right? Looking at behavioral cues, or it wanted to get to the other side. There you're attributing a mental state to the chicken. Okay. Okay, so understanding intentions in animals. Some examples, some classic examples of experiments have to do in a situation kind of like this. So researchers show chimpanzees an animation of a ball moving purposely towards another ball. Okay. Jumping over obstacles. Okay, so you have one ball, an animation, going to another ball, and it purposefully jumps. That's one condition you could have. And then the ball moves towards the second without the obstacle. Oh, they're out of order. The ball moves towards the second without the obstacle. And then the ball moves towards the second ball without the obstacle, but with the jump. Right. So this one's kind of weird. First one and the third one make sense. If there's an obstacle, the actor should jump over the obstacle. If there's no obstacle, they should just go straight towards the goal. But in the second condition here, where this is a strange choice, right? For the ball, it's just kind of jump in the middle. So these are kind of classic experiments that have been done. Researchers will look at things like amount of time looking, right? Looking experiments, we've talked about a bit. The amount of time just looking at stimulus can tell you something interesting about it. This is one way that experimenters have kind of tried to understand intentions in animals. Seeing what the animals do when they're given these different conditions. The thing I find kind of funny about it is that balls moving are not animals, right? They're not animate. Just because they move doesn't mean that they'll have intentions. So I do find these a little odd, but hey, they're there. They're kind of classic. Okay. Mixed results, mixed findings on those kind of tasks too, okay? All right. Here's a quote. You can think about what we're talking about. Understanding mental states. When an agent's actions lead to successful goal completion, it is virtually impossible to distinguish when a participant is reading behavior or reading behavior and positing a mental state. Right? We've been talking about this quite a bit. And it's actually really difficult to be able to tell. Right? Even when we were just talking about it with like thought experiments, you can see how it would be difficult to know how to distinguish those two things. And it is difficult to understand in an animal cognition experiment how to distinguish between those two things. It's kind of like when we were talking about causality and tool use. Kind of difficult to distinguish all the time, right? Okay. So, one thing you can look at though, very clever, is accidents. So these are unintended actions, right? So the behavior is still happening, but it wasn't on purpose. So these can provide a bit of a clearer distinction between merely interpreting behavior and attributing a mental state. If an animal can pick up that something was an accident, maybe they are attributing a mental state. Right? Okay. So So a lot of the time when we're trying to study understanding intentions in animals, we're giving them some conditions or some conditions are accidents and some are clearly intentional. Okay, so here's an experiment in your textbook. And basically, there's two kind of cups that could have food in them, okay? And you see this experimenter up here, this is showing the two conditions. So there's an intentional hand grasp and an accidental hand flop. Okay, so when experimenters touch a food bowl, animals will generally be more interested in that food bowl, probably because they think, oh, there's food in there. They were interacting with it, right? So an intentional hand grasp, intentionally going and grabbing the cup, putting it back down. Or an accidental hand flop, so there's still contact being made between the hand and the bowl, but the experimenter's kind of just, whoops. Right, one's intentional and one's accidental. What you see in these different species, so there's tamarins, rhesus, monkeys, and chimpanzees, looking at these three different species in this experiment, and they found that more often than not, the animals will reach for the cup with the intentional hand grasp compared to the accidental hand flop. And some would say, oh, that's because they can read the intentions of the experiment. Okay. Kind of interesting. A more recent example, in dogs, is unwilling or unable. So basically, unwilling or unable relies, or it's attributed to the experimenter, but the dogs are being studied. So if an experimenter is unwilling to give a treat, or unable to give a treat, but trying to. Okay. So there's three different conditions in this experiment: teasing, clumsy, and blocked. Okay, so teasing would be teasing the dog with food, but then not giving it to them, right? Clumsy is the food's trying to be brought towards the dog and then it's just dropped. Blocked would be the food's brought towards the dog, an attempt is made to give the dog food, but the food can't get to the dog. So in all of these conditions, there's no food given, there's no treats actually given. Okay. So all dogs also experience all conditions. Okay, so this is a within groups experiment. Of course, things would be counterbalanced so that not all dogs are getting the same order, right, of these conditions. Okay. And they looked at the behavior of the dogs with cameras. Okay, so they recorded everything and they were able to use tracking software and then compared across conditions. What do the dogs do in these different conditions? Okay, so yeah, an important distinction to make is that there's no food given in any condition. Okay, so here's kind of a video actually showing how these different conditions were played out to the dogs in this experiment. Again, this just came out last year, so pretty current. So you can see she goes to give the food, but she keeps dropping it. Okay. See from different angles. This is clumsy. Poor dog. Keeps trying to eat it. Teasing, giving the food, taking it away. Dog gets uninterested pretty quickly. Okay, and this is the block. So here the intention is unwilling, or unable, I should say, unable. So she can't fit it through the hole. And she does all of these actions for a certain amount of time, right? For every single dog, regardless of their behavior, right? Okay, so those are those 3 conditions. Okay, so what do they find? Well, dogs certainly tell a difference between the conditions. We know that for sure. So here's some of the results. So here the dependent measure is percentage of time away from the box, so kind of walking away and leaving the experimenter, right? You can see in that the blocked condition there's a lot of variability between the dogs, but that things become more clear with the clumsy condition. Okay, so what was found was that dogs didn't develop preference for a willing but clumsy experimenter, right? So in this case, the clumsy experimenter is clearly willing to give the food because they keep trying, but they keep dropping it. So they can tell a difference between the conditions, right? But are they reading the intentions of the experimenter? Still can't really exactly know. But they can tell the difference between these conditions, which is pretty interesting. Okay. Okay. So understanding, seeing, and knowing also has to do with understanding others' intentions. And generally, because we are visual animals, right, do animals understand that seeing something leads to knowing something? So this was a pretty common, kind of an older experiment, or a line of thought, a line of questioning, a research question. Do animals understand that seeing leads to knowing? Right, so when I look underneath an object and see it, do animals understand that I then know what is underneath the object? Okay. And it has to do also with gaze and gestures. So here I'm talking about looking at something. Does the animal know if I look at something, that means there's valuable information there, or pointing at something? A lot of work is done with gaze following and pointing. So humans will follow the gaze of others to see what interesting or relevant stimuli are in their environment. You can even do this if you're just out and about and you look up. You'll see other people go. Look up. I do it sometimes just for fun. Not in a long time, actually. But humans follow the gaze of others, right? They want to see, oh, what are they looking at? And we know that chimpanzees will also gaze follow. So if you looked up around a bunch of chimpanzees, they'd probably also look up. Seeing to knowing, right? And dogs also seem to be particularly good at gaze and point follow. There's been a lot of work on gaze following and pointing with dogs. Lots of work. You might have noticed this even if you have cats and dogs. You might think if you point for your dog, they'll go to the thing, they'll go to the food, right? But a cat, it's like, whatever. Right? Okay. We'll come back to dogs and pointing though in a bit. First, let's talk about an experiment, I believe, with chimps once again. Yeah, chimpanzees. Okay, so there's a setup kind of like this in this picture where there's 4 different containers and there's food in one container. The experimenter comes in and puts the food in the container, and there's another experimenter who sees where the experimenter put the food. The experimenter that put the food in the container leaves, but then there's someone there who knows where the food is. Right. So the chimpanzees are watching this all happen. The experimenter comes in, 2 experimenters come in. One of them puts food in, it walks away. That experimenter walks away. But then there's someone there who observed that action happening, and they're the knower. And then a new experimenter comes in who has no information. So they're the guesser. So in these kind of experiments, the knower always points to the correct food location, and then the guesser just points to a random one out of the other 3. There's also the same kind of experiment where the guesser is also in the room, but they have a paper bag over their head. So here the thought is, okay, does seeing lead to knowing, right? Okay, so the thought here with these experiments from these experimenters is that if the chimpanzee selects the location that the knower is pointing to, then they understand that seeing is knowing, right? Especially in this condition with the paper bag over the head. Because the eyes are occluded, right? An alternative answer, once again, is that perhaps they associated the paper bag with the incorrect answer, or they associated the guesser with the incorrect answer over trials, right? So this is happening over several trials. This isn't just one trial. So maybe over time, the chimps are just learning who to trust, right? That was a major criticism of this experiment. It could just be associative learning, which we've seen time and time again. So the chimps, if you look at the data, they do use the knower increasingly more often over the course of training. Okay. But if you do this kind of experiment with 4-year-old humans, they reliably use the information from the knower on the first trial. So first trial, success, that means they're not necessarily learning or associating. They have this understanding that seeing is knowing, right? Okay. Some kind of subsequent studies with blindfolded or not blindfolded individuals still kind of support the same theory that chimps are improving through associative processes. Another killjoy explanation. I feel like a lot of the time, you can ask yourself, you see something with animals, it's like, oh, is it just associative learning? Got to rule that out. Okay, so some more recent seeing and knowing experiments. There are 2 kind of problems with the previous task that we just talked about. So not with the human children, but with the chimpanzees. The thing with chimpanzees is they're actually more likely to compete for food than cooperate for it. So they have to kind of use some kind of cooperation mechanism to know where the food is if they're watching someone else put the food. But chimps, in their life history, they compete more than they cooperate, right? So this kind of experimental, these conditions don't really align with their ecological history, right? Okay, so that's one problem. The other problem is that it's actually cross-species, right? It's a human pointing for a chimpanzee. Okay, so to kind of response to that was using okay. If chimpanzees are usually competing for food, let's see what happens when we have a dominant chimpanzee with a subordinate chimpanzee. And let's use 2 chimpanzees instead of a human and a chimp. So these 3 different conditions. Okay, so a dominant and a subordinate in every condition. Okay. Now you'll see that there are these kind of screens in the middle. And for one chimp, that food is visible, but for the other chimp, the food is occluded. In the middle, it's visible for both of them. See that? Okay, so here, the food reward shown by a banana is visible to both dominant and subordinate. But then here in condition 1, both food items are visible to the dominant, and in condition 3, they're both visible to the subordinate. Okay. So, I want to see what the chimpanzees do in these conditions, especially what the subordinate does. Okay. So the subordinate chimpanzee reliably took the food that only they could see, and did not take the food when the dominant chimpanzee could see it. Okay. So if we go back, so they did not take food when the dominant chimpanzee could see it. Okay. So they take food here, right? That one is occluded from the dominant, so they can take that food safely. But does this task really require attribution of knowledge states to others? It certainly requires knowledge of where you are in the hierarchy and who they are in terms of the hierarchy. It does require knowledge of what they can see. Okay. So some argue that it is the most parsimonious or the most simple, right? Most simple, to assume that chimpanzees are capable of attributing mental states, intentions, and theory of mind to others. So some would argue that that is the simplest explanation. They do have theory of mind, they can attribute mental states, and they do read intentions. Other labs argue that chimpanzees accomplish all of their success just through associative processes. Then a third perspective is that chimps are not attributing mental states, but they're making causal connections. So we talked about this a bit with the causality experiments, that they can then transfer between tasks. Okay. So basically, we don't know. People have different opinions. Okay. I kind of want to come back to dogs and gesture following, pointing. And we talked about this already a little. That point following in dogs has been extensively studied in animal cognition experiments due to dogs' relationships with humans, so domestication, right? We have a very close relationship with dogs. Earlier I said that dogs seem to be very good at pointing, and they do. But there are actually mixed results when you look at the literature, when you look at the research, the scientific research. But usually kind of showing this effect that dogs point follow. People who have found mixed results or kind of unconvincing results are wondering if dogs are following other cues from the experimenters. Is it just pointing and gaze following together? Is it another cue that the dogs are picking up on that the experimenters don't even realize they're kind of exhibiting? difficult, right? Because humans are we've co-evolved with dogs for a while. So in response to this kind of replicability crisis, right, because different labs are finding different things in the dog cognition world, research world, a recent paper kind of tried to answer this. Okay, let's try to get back to this point following thing. So what they did, this is kind of a movement happening in comparative cognition, and they're called many X experiments. So in this case, it's many dogs. There's many zoos, there's many chimps, there's many, all sorts of different animals. Okay. And what it is it's a way to try to get a ton of different labs that work on a similar thing to do the exact same experiment, so that they have a lot more research participants. The thing with animals is that they're hard to train. If they're wild, they're hard to house. That's one barrier, right? You often have low samples in your experiments because it takes so long to train animals and to house them and take care of them, right? With dogs, you have to get people bring their pets in, right? We don't just house dogs. It doesn't really happen. You ask people to bring their dogs in for an experiment. You can see why that would probably be difficult, costly. So this is kind of an answer to that. I thought it was really cool. I saw this at a conference I went to. I thought this was really great, these many X kind of experiments. Okay. So again, another recent experiment on dogs. So here, 20 different research groups across 9 countries came together, and they're all using the same protocol. So they're all working with different populations of dogs, and here was all about human-given pointing. Okay. So here you can see an example of the two of the conditions that have to do with pointing. So there's ostensive pointing and non-ostensive pointing. So ostensive pointing means they're also looking, okay, and then non-ostensive, their heads down. So the dog can't see where the experimenter is looking. So all these different labs did this exact same procedure. They had very strict protocol to follow. And unfortunately, what they found was that the point following was not different from what is expected by chance. So that's some recent work on this. Really cool study if you want to look into it more. Pretty sure it's out there. You can get to it with your university access, right? Okay. All right. So social knowledge talks quite a bit about attributing mental states. Basically, the answer is no, not sure. But if we move on, okay, to social knowledge, that's the understanding of relationships between individuals. Okay. So many animals are thought to live in socially complex societies. Thinking like chimps live in socially complex societies. We live in socially complex societies. But what is social complexity? So when I say knowledge of the relationships between individuals, it would be like knowing who someone's romantic partner is, or their mate in the animal world, right? Knowing who's related, things like that. Knowing who's dominant to who, who's subordinate to who. Okay. All right. So large group living from animals doesn't necessarily mean that there are complex social interactions or that there have to be complex cognitive mechanisms occurring, right? Because we know that eusocial insects have thousands of individuals that live within the same colony and they interact in many different ways, but we know there's not any complex cognitive mechanisms occurring there. Okay, so just because a large group of individuals are living together does not necessarily mean there is complexity as it is defined in the research world. Okay? So aspects of a complex social group, having dominance hierarchies, being able to realize who's related to each other, also identifying the sex of other individuals, and also having experience with other individuals in that social group. One important concept in complex social interactions is something known as redirected aggression. So we know that baboons and vervet monkeys will direct aggression towards individuals related to a conspecific that was aggressive towards them. So not retaliating necessarily the aggression to the same individual, but redirecting it to a related individual. Okay. All right. So kin relations, those who are related to each other. Okay, so vervet monkeys, they live in large social groups, and the matrilineal relationships determine rank and social structure. So, who's related to the mother? The female line determines rank and social structure, because the males disperse. So the stable kin relations are through females. Okay. This is the structure in these vervet monkeys. So we know that members recognize their own kin. You can see that through grooming, for example. Kin are more likely to groom kin. Right. But not just kin recognition, members also benefit from the recognition of third-party relationships, so recognizing other kin groups. For example, you can see why that would be important because you want to avoid threatening an individual part of a more dominant matriline. Okay, so we'll briefly talk about dominance rank. I'm sure you've heard about this before. Again, with the vervet monkeys, there's this matrilineal. It's called a linear transitive hierarchy. That's the specific kind of hierarchy it is. There are lots of different kinds of hierarchies. We won't get into that really, but that's the kind in vervet monkeys. Really, basically what it means is that 1 is dominant to 2, 2 is dominant to 3, 1 is also dominant to 3. Pretty straightforward. Okay. So a question could be, do monkeys know the entire hierarchy, or do they just know who is directly above and below them in the hierarchy? And when you look at grooming interactions, it actually suggests that vervet monkeys are aware of the locations of individuals in the group hierarchy, not just who is directly above and who is directly below. So for example, if you have 2 more subordinate monkeys grooming each other, and then a dominant monkey shows up, the most subordinate between the 2 will leave, so that the dominant can engage in grooming with the other monkey. That happens pretty reliably. So it's not just being groomed, it's grooming and being groomed. It's that relationship. And you can see that here in this figure. How often a lower ranking female leaves compared to a higher ranking female. Pretty clear. Okay, so the cognitive mechanism that's believed to be happening here, some Researchers call it an equivalence class, where stimuli are grouped together through experience. So because the monkeys have many different experiences with each other, they form an equivalence class consisting of members of a certain matrix based on prior association. So they're having lots of interactions with other members, and they form this equivalence class. All right. Okay. Conclusion here is just that interpersonal interactions are challenging for all species, but we have different tools to deal with them, and they don't necessarily have to be attributing mental states to another conspecific, right? Okay. All right. That's it for today. For the second half of lecture, I'll have those posted online. All right. Thanks, guys.
Hello, those of you who are listening.